So my name is Hedy Rees, and I am the program director for the UC Berkeley Center on Institutions and Governance at the Institute of International Studies. And I would like to welcome you to this conference on religious norms and the public sphere, the challenge. So it's a wrap-up conference. We know each other quite for a long time, for some of us, because it's combining two projects. One is a transatlantic network of scholars on Muslim religion, identity, secularism, democracy, and citizenship, and it's funded by the Partner University Fund. And the other project is funded by the Social Research Council, and it's called Religious Norms in the Public Sphere. This event is co-sponsored by Center. The Kaddish Center at Berkeley Law is a Center for Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Union. And the goal was to build an international scholarly network to analyze the call by people of all faiths for greater recognitions of religious norms by government, legislature, schools, and as we call, public sphere. This conference will be webcast, and I would like now to give the floor immediately to Olivier Roy, who is one of the co-founders, the grandfather, in fact, of this project. Olivier, the grandfather.
The grandfather.
Okay. Tell that to my kids. Yes, as Hedy said, the genesis of the project goes back to some years ago, because the first conference we organized was in 2004, I think, you know. And at that time, we thought we were quite original, you know, that we were the only ones to do that, to work on the religious side, the public sphere, and so. But of course, in the course of the time, we realized that we were not alone, and that there were different initiatives here and there, you know, from different contexts. Interesting enough, most from the context of the legal studies than the context of sociology, because one of our aim was to disentangle, you know, the study of religion in the public sphere from the studies from the immigration studies, because until recently, everything concerning Islam in Europe was part and parcel of the sociology of immigration. And the problem is that there is, I would say, less and less migrants, or there might be more and more migrants, but it has less and less to do with the status of Islam as a religion in the West. So we wanted to disentangle and to study religion in the public sphere, and first Islam by itself. And of course, we realized that different in other universities and in other disciplinary fields, there was also researches on this issue of the religion in the public sphere. And it's not by accident that most of our partners are in fact law schools, more than departments of sociology. Even if at the origin, our project was carried on by political scientists and sociologists. So this interdisciplinary dimension is good news, and we are working on that. So it's why I'm very happy to have Professor Ferrari with us, who is heading the Religare project, which is a big research project associating, you know, different universities on very close topics. Professor
Good morning. My name is David Lieberman, and I'm here as the interim director of Berkeley Law's Kaddish Center for Morality, Law, and Public Affairs. I want to welcome all of you to this first day of the meeting. I know for most of you, this is simply the most recent iteration of a set of deliberations you've been conducting over the past several years. I want to thank, on behalf of us all, Hedy Riss for taking the lead in organizing the events for today and tomorrow, and for placing us in such a comfortable situation, for securing such wonderful weather for these 2 days. In the face of such assembled erudition, I will not make any substantive comments about the content of the meetings. Rather, I do want to say that it is a very great privilege for the Kadish Center and for the Berkeley campus to be a part of these discussions and to provide a scholarly site for some of the meetings. This is a global scholarly conversation, of great moment and great significance. You have much to teach the natives at Berkeley, and we look forward to your contributions. And I do want to say how much we value the opportunity to have this meeting in Berkeley and to have the benefits of your insights and scholarship. So thank you very much and welcome. I think I can be heard without the microphone. I have the privilege of chairing this first panel. Your programs list the speakers and their institutions. We will proceed in the order of the program. According to the arrangements for the meeting, each speaker is asked to limit his comments for 20 minutes. I'm the designated thug who will try and keep people to the timetable, and it won't be Berkeley minutes. It'll be, I don't know, Swiss minutes or some other minutes, but not Berkeley minutes. And we'll begin, of course, with Professor Roy, and I ask him to lead us off this morning.
Thank you very much. So I will focus on recent events, or more exactly recent trends. It is interesting to see that apparently there are two different and almost opposite trends taking place in Western Europe, at least, and in the Mediterranean Arab world, about the role and the room for the religious markers. At a time when the democratic movement in some Arab countries put into question the centrality of Islam as a legal and political concept, we have, on the contrary, in Europe, a trend to reassess the role of Christianity and, in some instances, more specifically Catholicism, as part of the leading culture, the Leitkultur, as say the Germans. So what looks like a beginning of a disconnect in the Arab countries is contemporary with what seems to be a reconnection, between religion and culture and politics in Western Europe. Of course, I'm speaking here of religious markers. I'm not speaking here of religious practices, nor of faith. The interesting fact is that many actors who push for the reconnect of religious markers and the public sphere are people who openly claims to be atheist, atheist or, well, not churchgoers, Geert Wilders in Netherlands is not very known, for attending, church on Sunday morning. And most of the, same with Marine Le Pen in France, most of the so-called populist movements in Western Europe, even when they call, for the comeback of a Christian reference, are not Christian movements at all. In Italy, the Lega Nord is not specifically Catholic. No, more exactly, it may be Catholic, but not Christian. They openly criticize the church hierarchy on very specific issues, like immigration, for instance. And they consider that the Archbishop of Milano as almost a traitor, which is not a Christian attitude, but they propose that the cross should be put on the Italian national flag, for instance. So we have a very typical example of this discrepancy. Hence, the problem of using the term religion. What do we mean by that? It's, of course, things are complex now. And it's difficult to tag people as believers, not believers, unbelievers, apostates, churchgoers or not. So it's sociology of religion has a tradition, to scale, if I can say that, the level of religious practices. But I don't think that it's relevant for our issue, the issue we are addressing here. The issue is clearly that the connection, the reference to a Christian marker in Western public sphere is not associated with faith. And by the way, it's a problem for the church, The Catholic Church, of course, wants to go further, and to reinstate, to revivify, the cultural marker by the faith, But it doesn't work like that. And here we have something which we have to underline. Even if in most of the Western European constitution, most of them, we have a separation of church and state, it doesn't mean that the constitution excludes religion from the public sphere. Even in France, with the what is now, I would say, more an ideology than a constitutional concept, laïcité, religion has never been excluded from the public sphere. It's a reconstruction, it's an ideological reconstruction by the secularists now to say that religion is excluded. It has never been. No. It has, religion, the religious marker in the public sphere is regulated by the state, not excluded, bell ringing, processions are not forbidden. No. Hence the debate, the prayers in the street, the Muslim prayers in the street, or the debate on the veil and on the burqa, because it has never been excluded. So religious practices as such has never been excluded from the public sphere. So now the debate is more on, okay, there is no exclusion, but there is a dominant religion, either culturally or in religious terms. And this idea of the dominant religion is taking ground. Of course, there is an ambiguity. Is that a religion as such, or is just a cultural tradition? But it's interesting to see how the populist movements, which all of them were born from a secular milieu, and often, by the way, they had a leftist component at the beginning. You cannot now say in Europe that the extreme right, what we call the extreme right, is a continuation from the fascist and neo-Nazi movement and so on. It was true for many of the first leaders, like Jean-Marie Le Pen in France. Clearly, his political past was linked with the Vichy regime and the collaboration with the Nazi forces and so on. So we have this same kind of political genealogy in Belgium, in Germany, but not in Holland, not in Denmark, you know. And by the way, now we have a second generation of populist leaders who are just discarding, you know, the references to the first half of the European 20th century. And here there is, you know, when we look, for instance, at the Swiss referendum on the minarets or the debate on the burqa, it's clear that there's been a shift. The issue is not to ensure, to promote secularism and separation of church and state. The issue is clearly that some religious markers are now positioned explicitly as foreign, as alien. No. And this view is not just a view of the populist movement. It's more and more now shared, you know, by the establishment, if I can say that. We have interesting, you know, court decisions, and of course, my colleague Marco Ventura knows better than me on that. But I will refer, for instance, for a paper written by Maria Mencini. When she stressed that on dealing with the cross, you know, in Italy and in Bavaria, in Germany, the courts explicitly said that there is nothing wrong to have a Catholic sign in the schoolrooms because it's part of the culture, the national culture. So the courts didn't rule on equality of religion, on secularism, on separation of church and state. You know. They acknowledge, you know, the existence of a culture, a national culture, whose roots are in Christianity. And by the way, it's just a comment, have the impression, which we have to, it has to be corroborated by more studies, that some years ago, the expression was Judeo-Christianism, you know, the Judeo-Christian tradition of Europe. And during the last 2 years, I have the impression that the term Judeo has disappeared. You know. It's Christianism, which is interesting because it's never said explicitly. But it's not about Judeo-Christianism, which is, by the way, coherent if we speak about the cross. You know. But it's not by chance if the debate now is with the cross, because the cross is Christian, clearly. It's not the Bible, it's not prayers, it's not like in the USA where the definition of the religious markers is more fluid, if I can say that, you know. It's less associated with a given religion. Still Christian, but, you know, in a larger perspective. No, here it's clearly Christian. And we have something which is interesting here. There have always been crosses in Italy and in Bayern, for instance, always, and in some part of France too. But it was not an issue. It was part of the landscape, you know, part of the furniture, if I can say that. You know. Nobody noticed. You know. Oh, yes, the cross. Okay, so. But the fact that the cross has been spotted, you know, as a case of contention, you know, and has been reinstated by court decision, the last decision was the European Court of Human Rights, makes the symbols now explicit, you know. It's not about just something part of the landscape, you know. This cross is here because the court, and recently the Strasbourg Court, has decided that it could be, or maybe it should be here, because it's part of the culture, national culture. So we have a redefinition of what the national culture is. We have a redefinition of what a religious marker is. So it's not just, we are not, in a continuity. Has always been crosses, has always been bell ringing and so on. No, we are in a process of reconstructing the religious marker as a symbol of identity, of European identity. And it has far-reaching consequences, of course, which I will not go into detail, just to open the debate. And it's interesting to see that the reinstallment of the cross, or that the legal justification of the cross has not been made so much under the pressure of a Catholic lobby. Of course, the Church was in favor of maintaining the crucifix, of course. But the Church was not at the vanguard, I would say, of the debate. It was both, the public opinion, if I can say that, populist movement, and at the end, the decisions of the courts. So the connection between religion and culture he has been defined outside, a theological debate, if I can say that. The debate is not on what religion is, on what faith is. And this also puts the Church in a complex situation. The Church, the Catholic Church, always stressed that European is Christian. But that the Europeans have forgotten the consequences of being Christian because they have lost the faith. And so the Church, the Catholic Church, the present Catholic Church policy is to, use the cultural bridge to bring cultural Christian back into real religion. So the Church is not fighting here for freedom of religion. Of course, officially the Church is supporting freedom of religion. But the Catholic Church doesn't consider that all religions are equal. And by the way, no religion considers that all religions are equal, by definition. There is truth. And truth is always a big problem. So the Church has to reintroduce, this faith dimension, which is outside the reach of lawyers and of social scientists also. We have nothing or little to say about faith. But we cannot ignore this dimension because it's precisely what makes the difference between a purely religious symbols and a cultural symbol rooted in religion. So that's what is going on now in Europe. We have to rethink the meaning of the religious signs because this religious sign has been isolated, I would say, by the debate, on the European identity, on separation of church and state, of the presence of religion in the public sphere. And I will end without going into details, because first because I'm still looking at that. And what is going on the other side of the Mediterranean, it's interesting that the democratization precisely entails a debate on freedom of religion, by definition. Freedom of religion in tradition of the Ottoman law, which still is pervasive, more or less directly in many Arab legislation, consider that freedom of religion is not an individual freedom. It's not a human right. It's a minority right. It's the right of a community to practice. And then, of course, there is a hierarchy of the communities and so on. But it's a minority right, which, by the way, is an idea which is largely spread in the West too. The idea that, well, Muslims are a minority. And we have an interesting mirror effect between in Europe and Muslim countries by defining, in fact, the other religion as a foreign religion which is tolerated, which should be tolerated, but is tolerated, is not on an equal foot. But if you change the paradigm from belonging to a community to being an individual citizen, then you change the paradigm of religious affiliation. Religion, in this case, is a choice, or should be a choice, which brings the issue of conversion. We had in Florence conference on conversions in the Mediterranean 2 months ago. And even if conversions are, in statistical terms, not very numerous, in symbolic terms, it's very, very important, because it pushes to redefine what is religious affiliation. And it destroys the connection between religious affiliations and identity. A conversion is not a matter of identity, by definition. It's a choice of something which is purely religious. So, hence the debate now in countries which are debating about constitution, what will be the definition of Islam in the next constitution. And there is a consensus to say that, yes, we have to keep a reference to Islam as the religion of the nation, of the religion of the state, of the religion of the people, and so on and so, which, by the way, exists in some Western countries, so it's not a contradiction with being a democratic state. But then, how do you redefine Sharia? How you redefine, precisely apostasy, for instance, and here, it's open. Ghanouchi, some days ago, made a very clear-cut declaration in Tunisia. He said, well, we don't ask for Sharia, we don't ask for, we have no Islamic agenda. We have a democratic and political agenda. We accept constitutions, elections, individual freedom, and so on. And he explicitly, at different times, refers to the Akka party experience in Turkey. Which is very interesting because in the Maghreb, the reference to the Akka party is explicit. The Moroccan authorized Islamist party, the Justice and Development Party, explicitly used the terms, the name of the Turkish party. And Ghanouchi also made an explicit rapprochement. In Egypt, it's more complex. It's more complex. The Muslim Brothers do not necessarily consider at all Erdogan as a model. So it's another story. So it's open. And so we have now to keep, in mind, the two parallel or diverging. It's some sort of a reverse movement. Western Europe trying to redefine an identity which will go beyond individual freedom, in fact. While in the Muslim world there is an endeavor in precisely defining citizenship without reference to the belonging to a precise religious group. So how it will work, then it's why we are here, to debate on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Roy, and I'll now turn to Professor Ferrari and the European perspective. Thank you.
Well, I think I can start while we wait for the screen. Well, I'd like to speak of religion and the public sphere in the European legal systems. And my starting point is that differently from the US, in Europe, religions have a very prominent and a very visible position in the state legal systems. If you look at the teaching of religion at public schools, if you look at public financing of religions, you have many examples of states that support religions in Europe. Now, this strong presence of religion in the public sphere is increasingly challenged by is increasingly challenged by a couple of processes, a couple of changes. First, the increasing number of people who do not profess any religion and who question the support given by states to religious community. And second, the increasing number of people who profess religions that are new to Europe, Islam, and that are excluded from the support given by the states to the dominant religions. So the first group, those who do not profess any religion, wants to reduce the presence of religion in the public sphere, while the second group wants to increase, to enlarge the presence of religion in the public sphere so that also new religions like Islam can enjoy the same advantages up to now given only to dominant religions. So we have a group that supports a neutral public sphere, that is without any religious connotation. But we have also another group that supports a plural public sphere, inclusive of different religions. And then, to complete my picture, we have a number of mainstream religions that oppose both the neutrality and the plurality of the public sphere. They oppose neutrality because they are afraid to be pushed into the private area if we have a neutral public sphere. But they oppose also a plural public sphere because these dominant religions are afraid to lose their dominant position. That is the picture as I see it. These problems are dealt with by the European states in different ways. Each state has its own history, culture, etc. But with a lot of caveats and a lot of prudence, I think it's possible to identify three patterns in Europe. The first pattern is very popular among the Catholic and Orthodox countries, and it is based on the idea that traditional religions can still play a central role in granting the national cohesion that is required to face globalization and pluralization. A good example of this model is Italy, my country. Italy is trying to govern the growing plurality, religious plurality, ethical plurality, cultural plurality. It's trying to govern this plurality through Catholicism. That is, through a set of values provided by the Catholic religion that is raised to the rank of civil religion of Italy. A good example of the Italian pattern is provided by the crucifix debate. As you know, in the Italian public schools, it's compulsory to have a crucifix in each classroom. But a couple of years ago, the European Court decided that crucifixes had to go because this compulsory presence violated the religious freedom of the students. The Italian government appealed against the decision, and it argued that the crucifix was not primarily a religious symbol, but it was the symbol of Italian identity. That is, It manifests the historical and cultural tradition of the country and a set of values, human dignity, tolerance, etc., upon which the national identity is based. Therefore, everybody who wants to come and live in Italy has to accept this set of values and has to accept the crucifix in the classroom, because it is an expression of the roots of the Italian identity. That was the idea. And what is interesting is that Italy was not isolated in arguing in this way. It was supported against the European Court, not only by a number of Catholic countries, but by a number of Orthodox countries too, like Russia, for example. What does it mean? It means that on this issue of the crucifix, a new alliance is taking shape that includes Orthodox and Catholic countries, but excludes Protestant countries. They are not part of this group. Then we have a second pattern that in a way is specular to the first. Again, there is a need of national identity and social cohesion, but here the idea is traditional religions are too weak to provide these goods. Therefore, a common citizenship can be built only around a set of secular principles, democracy, equality, etc. And every group and every individual has to accept these secular principles independently from his origin, from his preferences, creed, etc. These principles are assumed to be neutral from a religious and cultural point of view, and therefore secularism can claim the right to govern the whole public sphere, because this public sphere is based on neutral principle. Now, here the example are the French laws that prohibited religious symbols at school and the ban of burqa in the street. And I would like to underline a passage of the French Constitutional Council decision regarding the burqa, where the Constitutional Council says that self-determination of women is irrelevant. Even if women decide to wear the burqa in a conscious and free way, nevertheless they are in an objective situation of inferiority and exclusion, which is incompatible with the principle of the French Republic. And that is an interesting idea, in my opinion, because behind this statement, we have the conviction that if national identity has to be built around the notion of laicity, then the state has the task to educate secular citizens, to create laic citizens. And France too is not isolated in this approach. There are some European international organizations that more or less are heading the same way. Then we have a third pattern, and it is best exemplified by the United Kingdom, that is the European country that went further in providing a multicultural organization of society. The United Kingdom are a common law country, and in the common law countries, the central role in shaping the legal system is not taken by the lawmaker, but it is taken by the courts. And in the United Kingdom, in the attempt to find a balance between the different groups living in the country, the courts rely on the fundamental human rights. obviously. But sometimes they give an interpretation of the fundamental human rights that make them conflicting, one against another. Let me give you the example of the British Supreme Court decision in the case of the Jewish Free School. The Jewish Free School is a Jewish school that has an admission policy that privileges students born to a Jewish mother. And according to this policy, led to the exclusion from the school of a student born to a non-Jewish mother who had converted to Judaism. And the Supreme Court said that this admission policy is focused on the maternal descent of the student, and therefore it is not based on religion. It is based on ethnicity. It is an ethnical element that is taken into consideration. Therefore, this admission policy violates the Race Relations Act that forbids any discrimination on the basis of ethnicity. And here we have an interesting point, because the membership rules of the religious group are defined no more by the religious group itself, but by the court. And so the internal autonomy of the religious community is a little bit at stake in this case. And we have a conflict between two fundamental rights: non-discrimination on the one hand, and religious freedom on the other hand. These are the patterns. What is happening? There are two processes going on in Europe. They are well known, so I just mentioned them. On the one hand, we have a process of pluralization that is not only a religious pluralization, but also cultural, ethnic, and ethical pluralization. On the other hand, we have the process of deprivatization of religion. Everybody knows these processes. What is important, in my opinion, is that these two processes are taking place within a context. And the context is dominated by the fear of the European decline. Europeans are afraid of a demographic, political, economical, military decline. The idea is the future is no more here, the future is elsewhere. And therefore, this lack of confidence of Europeans provokes a constant oscillation between, on the one hand, the impulse to confine more rigidly religion in the private sphere, and on the other hand, the desire to strengthen national identity through the revitalization of the dominant religion only. Either we put all religions in the private corner, or, second strategy, we should support the dominant religion to rebuild a national identity, a social cohesion, that kind of things. What to do? Nobody knows what to do. What I and my colleagues within the Religare project are trying to do is developing a reflection on the meaning of a public sphere, and more precisely is trying to formulate a distinction between common space, public space, and institutional space. Let me explain what I mean. By common space, I mean the physical space that people have to enter to meet their basic needs. It is a space that it is not accessed with the intent to take part in a political debate. But I access this common space because I have to go to work, because I have to buy food or to buy clothes. From a normative point of view, this common space should be kept as accessible as possible, as open as possible, to avoid segregating into their homes people who do not feel able to enter this common space, giving up their religious symbols, religious convictions, etc. And here is where I find problematic the French ban of burqa, because the French ban of burqa is affecting exactly this common space. Then we have what I call the public space, which is the space of the discussion, politically oriented discussion, the space where a public discourse takes shape. And speaking of this public space, it has a task, and the task is to propose, to create projects of collective interest. It's a space where different proposals, different projects take shape. And therefore, again, from a normative point of view, this space should be kept as free as possible, because freedom is the precondition for being creative, for create something. And here is where I find problematic the ban of religious symbols in French schools, because it means preventing students from manifesting their conception of life, their project of life. And then finally we have the institutional space, and the institutional space is not the space of discussion, but it is the space of decision, the space where decisions binding on all are taken. And therefore, in order to gain general respect and general recognition for these binding decisions that are taken by judges, politicians, etc., this space must be and also must appear fair and impartial. The problem here is the fairness. And that is where, for example, I find problematic the presence of the crucifixes in some courtrooms, in some European countries, like Italy, like others, because the presence of religious symbol, specific religious symbol is putting in question this, can put in question this fairness and impartiality. Final, last slide, two more points. First, when we speak of the institutional space, fairness and impartiality can be granted only through the exclusion of religion, ? Or can we think of some kind of inclusive neutrality? We have legal examples. The possibility of taking oaths in a secular or in a religious form. And the religious oath can be on the Bible, on the Quran, on the Gospel, etc. Or the possibility to conclude religious marriages, not only civil marriages, that are valid for the state. So this is something I would like to explore. How much and how far it is possible to imagine an inclusive neutrality. I think that it's not always possible, but in some cases it could work. And a final point, I don't think that we should imagine that there is just one or two solutions that are valid for the whole of Europe. Europe is different, so the approach, in my opinion, should be each country has to develop its own path towards some broadly defined common arriving point, but respecting the national tradition, history, legacy of each country. That's all.
Thank you. Is that working? I hope so. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Hedy, for this invitation to be here today. I'm really delighted to be part of this ongoing conversation, and particularly to listen and to learn from all of you over the next 2 days. My field is international law, and my work in this area emerges out of attempts to analyze and think about competing accounts of religious freedom as a right in international legal and political theory. And obviously there's quite a deal of overlap in what we've just heard in both Professor Wa and Professor Ferrari's presentations. So what I'll try to do is just add a few other points to think about. What I would like to speak about is the post-2000 really post-2001 jurisprudence of the European Court under Article 9. And this, I think, helps us to see some quite interesting dynamics in European law on these issues. I guess it goes without saying that what's interesting, particularly about the place of Islam and Islamic norms in European nation states, and I would add more broadly within what I call the secular nomos of the European Court itself, and it's interesting to think about that dual relationship, is how these encounters and cases are catalyzing and unsettling existing legal categories, existing normative assumptions, and forcing us to think about both the historical and theoretical premises of the whole notion of a modern liberal political order. In my work, I've tried to look at two questions, which I think the European cases raise. The first concerns the scope of the right itself, the scope of Article 9. How does one think about and establish the appropriate scope of the claim of right itself? For example, there's been great controversy over whether Article 9 includes the right to be free from injury to religious sensibilities or feelings. And there's a line of cases in the European Court that takes this position. And it's really that line of cases, Otto Preminger and Wingrove, that got me interested in this whole question. I find that in American settings, the question is not even at the table, but in Europe, I think it is a much more live question. The second question is how we think about the nature of the so-called secular public sphere itself, and of course that's the topic for this conference. What is the problem, or what is the problematic that the secular public sphere is meant to solve? What is the relationship between religion and morality within that space? And I found Professor Ferrari's breaking down of those concepts extremely helpful, actually, in trying to disaggregate some of the concepts that get bundled, I think, into this question of the secular public sphere. If I might say so, I think the European Court has made a spectacular mess of these questions by failing to disaggregate and think more carefully about how it defines notions of secularity and neutrality in its jurisprudence. And of course, the tactic of using the margin of appreciation becomes a kind of residual or defensive mechanism by which the problem is avoided rather than confronted normatively. And that's what I want to argue today. The concept of the secular public sphere has been haunted from its very beginning by three problems, in my view, at least three problems. And let me just set them out very briefly. The first concerns the right to religious freedom itself. Now, what is the object of protection of the right? I heard Professor Watt saying that in much modern thinking about this question, we think of the right in very individualistic terms, as an individual right, a right of individuals. Interestingly, the European courts have not taken that position. Never mind courts outside of Europe, the actual jurisprudence of the European courts itself, as many here know, deal with all sorts of complicated questions of church autonomy and the claims of religious communities. And there's a whole series of cases that the court has dealt with, thinking about the collective aspects of the right, particularly church autonomy questions in Europe. And it's a very rich line of cases. But in much academic writing, I find people think about this in terms of what they say is the right to freedom of conscience. And there's a subtle transformation that has occurred in normative discussions, where we don't talk about freedom of religion per se, we talk about the freedom of individual conscience. And this, I think, is a transformation that I think we need to think a lot more carefully about. Now, particularly in the United States, and much academic writing here, we see a further transformation, a third kind of transformation, where people think about religious freedom in terms of values of autonomy in much of contemporary writing. And so we think about religious freedom in terms of freedom of choice, rather than freedom of conscience. And there's a very unstable normative set of assumptions about how conscience and autonomy relate in the modern secular imaginary of religious freedom. Now, I don't have time to go into all of this, but what I'm suggesting is there is a deep normative set of assumptions and confusions, instabilities that underlie this whole body of law, and that in itself, I think, is very interesting, and is being further unsettled by these cases. The second dilemma, of course, I won't speak in detail about this, is how to demarcate the spheres, how to identify a realm of public reason separate from a sphere of public life, private faith, and how to contain and construe these separate spheres. Europe is, of course, fascinating to think about on this, and what's going on in France shows all the dilemmas that this notion of public and private gives rise to. I think what we could say with some confidence is that this notion of a kind of freestanding public sphere where reason and rational deliberation is in some sense separable from religion and arguments of religious communities has, I think, pretty much been shown to be completely false. And then third, and perhaps the deepest dilemma, is how to secure the authority of public reason itself. And I see this as, in a sense, the extension and crisis of the Enlightenment project writ large, the quest to place reliance on reason as some kind of universal category in order to give primacy to moral philosophy, secular theorizing over ecclesiastical and theological positions. And of course, that is a deep set of questions which I can't go into now. So what I have, at a theoretical level, taken from these questions and cases is what I think of as a kind of circular and self-reinforcing dialectic that we see in the European cases between notions of neutrality on the one hand and universality on the other. Now, Charles Hirschkind, who I don't think is here, has made this interesting observation that in much modern writing about these issues, Europe is seen as simultaneously exceptional and universal. For scholars such as Marcel Gauchet and Charles Taylor, the close intertwining of Christianity with secular modernity seems to cause no undue theoretical complications. Rather, it confirms Christianity's unique ability to transcend its own particularity. And of course, if one takes this view, then the inexorable rise of modern liberal political orders is really said to be the signal achievement of Latin Christendom itself. For Hirschkind, both secular politics and private belief on this view emerge as the inheritors of the arc of religion returning to itself. The public sphere is neutral to religion, but unique to a particular political order, that particularly the role of Christianity within the broader European normative sphere itself, although with all the national variations that, of course, Professor Ferrari points to. On the other hand, the right to religious freedom is universal. And why is it universal? Because it protects religion in its true form. Whether we define it in terms of religion, conscience, or autonomy, and again, the argument very quickly collapses once we push the particulars. So what I have suggested in my writing is that two pathologies come out of this way of thinking about the problem. The first is that the claim to have secured secular authority in the public sphere rests at some level on the notion of a unique vantage point of epistemic neutrality. I think this is the French position at some level, which is above history, above politics, and above culture, from which other histories and political formations can be ranked and demarcated as either tolerable or intolerant. Of course, the difficulty with this way of thinking is that accounts of neutrality and secularity, as we see in the European cases, quickly devolve into the unarticulated liberal strategy of hypostasis or reification of a historically specific political order. And I think to make this point most clearly, it's interesting to think about the pre-2000 cases of the European Court, the cases where the cross was just a part of the furniture, I think, as Professor Weil put it, a background assumption that no one seriously questioned, the right to be free from injury to religious feelings in a majority Catholic area of Austria was seen to raise no really serious problems for notions of neutrality or secularity. And the court, of course, in that case, upheld the right to restrict a publication, a film deemed offensive to Catholics. It's only once we get into the Islam cases that we start to see the dialectic reversing in quite spectacular ways. And I think that the greatest and the most catastrophic decision of the court was the first one, the one Professor Weil mentioned, the Refa Partisi case, where effectively the court held that a political party seeking to institute reforms to the public sphere in Turkey through democratic means, the notion of plural legal systems premised on Sharia and other religious traditions, was itself a human rights violation. Now, this is just preposterous if one thinks about religious freedom in a global sense. And of course, if one thinks about states like India or South Africa, as I was speaking about last night, we see very interesting and complicated plural arrangements of religious and secular law. And for the court to say that the institutionalization of Sharia within a Turkish framework is itself a violation of the European Convention, I think was a mistake from which the court, I'm not sure how the court can really recover from that position. And this then leads to the second pathology, and this I think is more problematic in some senses, the notion of religious freedom as a stable norm entirely separable from specific histories and relations of power. Once one starts delving into the genealogy and history of the emergence of the right itself, we start to see rival intellectual traditions and normative dissonances which are internal to the right to religious freedom itself. And what I've tried to do in my work is show that within the European tradition of religious freedom, if we go back into the early modern period and we think about if you like, the early Enlightenment tradition of religious freedom, we see that it's quite distinct and different in its thinking and assumptions from what followed later in the 18th century kind of Kantian tradition of religious freedom. Now, what's interesting is that Article 9 today encompasses both of these traditions, and we see the court moving seamlessly between notions of public order on the one hand and the rights of others on the other, and merging in its case law these two traditions without distinguishing their different genealogies. So, just in the interest of time, I'll just set this out quite briefly. If we look back to the older kind of 17th century liberal tradition as it emerged in Europe, we see that the public sphere was understood in terms of social peace and religious liberty conceived in jurisdictional terms, the classic separation in effect being based on a simultaneous religious and secular arguments. This conception derived from a civil philosophy which sought to desacralize the state and led over time to the churches losing their civil and political authority, and to the gradual spiritualization of religion, I think, in Europe. Now, one could, of course, read some of the early cases in the court's jurisprudence along these lines, particularly Otto Preminger and Wingrove. One could see as the state, in effect, seeking to preserve religious peace within those regions, and that injury to religious feelings being protected not as an incident of freedom or individual freedom, but more as an attempt to maintain harmony between plural religious communities in European nation states. Now, of course, if we apply that to Sahin and Dogru and Begun in England, the argument is preposterous, I think, that, for example, a medical student at a university in Turkey wearing a headscarf is a threat to peace within Turkey. The argument really can't be understood in those terms. If we then look into the 18th century, this later tradition of religious freedom, we see the public sphere being reconceived not in terms of peace, but in terms of a moral theory of justice, and religious liberty being grounded in a complex and, as I said, unstable notion of freedom of conscience. This, I think, this conception led over time, it derived from a metaphysical philosophical tradition which simultaneously sacralized reason and rationalized religion. And here, I think, if we delve back into Kant's religion within reason alone, we start to see this very interesting historical trajectory of religious freedom. Now, the jurisprudence, I think, today of the court entangles both of these traditions. So the court can restrict religious freedom to protect public order and social peace on the one hand, and it can restrict it to protect the so-called rights of others on the other. And I think it's helpful in the same way that Professor Ferrari disaggregated notions of public space. It's helpful to disaggregate these notions of the Article 9.2 jurisprudence of the court. So what I suggest then is, if we look at this historical genealogy, we start to see that religious freedom in, of course, the European jurisprudence, but more broadly, is not a single stable principle existing outside of culture or spatial geographies or outside of power, of course, but is rather a contested, polyvalent concept existing and unfolding within histories of concrete political orders. And if that is correct, if these two arguments are correct, that neutrality and universality need to be understood in these terms, then what I think the theoretical challenge is to think about pluralizing in a normative sense how we understand the right on the one hand, and simultaneously relativizing it historically into the contexts in which it's being contested. And so Professor Ferrari's idea that these accommodations will occur differently in different political orders within European states, it strikes me as entirely correct. So just to finish my comments, I too would like to finish with the Grand Chamber's decision in Leipzig, the crucifix case. And so what's interesting there is that, having held that a Swiss school teacher who wears a headscarf on the one hand and a Turkish medical student on the other who wears a headscarf are threats to secularism and public order, in Leipzig we see the Grand Chamber saying that a state-mandated symbol of the dominant religion in every public classroom in Italy is a passive symbol. Brilliant. And that this is within the margin of appreciation of the public sphere of European nation states. Now, of course, in some sense, I support the decision of the Grand Chamber, but not its reasoning, which I think is kind of conclusory and narrow on these questions. If we look at the dissent in the case, two judges dissented. we see the dissent saying, well, we should perhaps accord a narrower margin of appreciation in cases like Italy, where there is a very strong dominant religion. We should be more sensitive to the rights of dissenters and non-believers, and that in this sense, an autonomous kind of notion of religious freedom is advanced. This idea of negative freedom can be compromised, the minority says, by state endorsement of majority religious symbols. Now, I think this is deeply flawed for an opposite set of reasons. It fails to take seriously the collective aspects of the claims in Leipzig, and this interesting discussion that's emerged of the cross as a kind of national cultural symbol. Of course, many scholars have argued for a long time that we should think about religious freedom as a cultural right. And so the kind of work that culture is being done in this equation, I think, needs a lot of further thought. But the most interesting thing for those who haven't read the case is to look at the two separate judgments right at the end. Judge Bonello from Malta on the one hand, and Judge Power from Ireland on the other. Now, Bonello, in highly polemical terms, says, no court, certainly not this court, should rob the Italians of their cultural personality, and before joining any crusade to demonize the crucifix, we should start by placing the presence of that emblem in Italian schools in its rightful historical perspective. And what Bonello does is he tries to distinguish the conception of neutrality. In understanding the conception of neutrality, he tries to draw a clear conceptual distinction between freedom of religion on the one hand and secularism on the other. And I must just quote this in concluding. The Convention has given this court the remit to enforce freedom of religion and of conscience, but has not empowered it to bully states into secularism or to coerce countries into schemes of religious neutrality. Well, this must come as really surprising news in Ankara. It is for each individual state to choose whether to be secular or not, and whether and to what extent to separate church and governance. And so Bonello then sets out, as I say, in fairly strident and emotional terms, a kind of liberal nationalist view where the furniture, the background furniture of the Italian people, of course, is deeply embedded in the history of Catholicism. And he points out how the entire education system in Italy is grounded in, and is a good thing, by the way, grounded in the values of the Catholic Church, tolerance, pluralism, neutrality, and so on. But just to conclude, I think the most interesting judgment in Leipzig is in fact Judge Power's separate concurring opinion. And what she does is expose, I think, the flaws of Bonello's reasoning. She agrees with Bonello that neutrality does not require a secularist approach, but she tries to articulate what I think of as a more value-pluralist approach to religious freedom, which is sensitive not only to the values of the majority, but also to those of religious and non-religious minorities. She says, I think quite rightly, that the crucifix is not a passive symbol, as the majority asserts. It is a carrier of meaning that speaks volumes, she says, without having to do so necessarily in a coercive or an indoctrinating manner. And so instead she looks rather at the environment in public schools in Italy. She looks to see how inclusive the treatment of minorities and non-religious students in those environments, and sees the presence of the crucifix as what she calls a stimulus to dialogue, a place, a space where genuine differences of opinion and honest exchange of views can occur. So in concluding, she emphasizes that the duty on European states is to respect religious freedom of all persons and groups, both majorities and minorities, but that on this conception of neutrality, what is required is a kind of pluralist and inclusive notion of the public sphere, rather than a secularist and exclusionary approach by the state. And if I understand it correctly, I think that's what Professor Ferrari was arguing for as well. But the distinction she draws between pluralism and secularism, I think, is very helpful to see how the margin of appreciation is used in the court's jurisprudence to avoid confronting this collective aspect of the right to religious freedom, whether viewed as a cultural right or more broadly as a collective right of a people to self-determination within the public sphere of the state itself. And so her judgment, I think, reveals the two dominant contradictions, or double contradiction, I think of it, in the court's Article 9 jurisprudence. She shows that the court, on the one hand, has found a danger of pressure or proselytizing when a Swiss school teacher wears a headscarf in Darlab, or when a medical student wears a headscarf in Sahin, but not when the state officially adopts a majority religious symbol in Laozi. That's one contradiction. The second and final contradiction is that the court has found that the democratic decision whether or not to perpetuate a religious tradition in the public sphere is a violation of the principle of secularism in Muslim majority states. And as I say, I think Refa is a catastrophe as a human rights decision. You in effect see the court there allowing Article 9 to be used by a militarist and enforced notion of secularism against genuine democratic movements within Turkey, but then on the other hand, within the margin of appreciation of a Christian majority state in Laozi. And I think if we think carefully about these two sets of contradictions, it helps to reveal what's going on at the moment in thinking about religion in the public sphere in Europe. Thank you.
We have no designated discussant for the panel, so we can immediately begin a general conversation on these three substantive presentations. I'll try and keep a queue, and if I miss people, I encourage you to denounce me, get my attention, or just intervene.
How can this cross as a class not be a passive symbol? To me, that seems commonsensical. No, I think how can it not be a passive symbol? The cross is not saying, I'm going to turn it on. Christianity is the one and true faith, and you all have to follow it. The cross does not say it. It's just hanging there as a piece of furniture. That is exactly what it is. States have two chances to deal with religion. They can exorcise them equally from public space, or they can pluralistically include all of them. For a while it seemed that courts had taken a very militant secularist position, like the Bundesverfassungsgericht in the crucifix case in '95. So the crucifix had to leave Bavarian school rules. Yeah? And the Lauti decision seems to favor now very cautiously a pluralist position, because the whole politics, the whole political climate has changed. One is really surrounded by populist movements. Even mainstream political parties are taking aggressive stances on reasserting national identity, and courts simply cannot completely immunize themselves from that changed melody out there in society. Now, so it is true that the Lauzi decision has kind of seen the cross as a cultural symbol stripped of its original religious contents, and so it is okay. Now, however, one has to really go into the fine-grained justifications for keeping the cross there. The administrative courts, the lower courts in Italy, I think both of them had argued not just that this is a symbol of national identity and so to transform it from religion into culture, they also argued something much more offensively and aggressively, that only Christianity is the source of secularism, and therefore it is the only universal religion, so it's in a way the only correct religion for a liberal state, and therefore we can have the cross hanging there. And that is, of course, an unsaid spoken affront to Islam. It's not really mentioned there, but the connotation of that line of reasoning is Islam is partial, stance-taking, and it's not the source of secularism, so it can be out while the Christian cross is in. Now the court in Laozi, the Grand Chamber, the second decision, it kind of reverses its earlier cultural vandalism decision, namely exorcising the cross from the classroom. Brunello had called it cultural vandalism. I think he's correct. I think he's correct. States cannot distinguish themselves from culture as they can distinguish and have historically differentiated themselves from religion. Look at Will Kinnicker, multicultural citizenship. He has a critique there of benign neglect, which works for religion, but it just does not work for culture. Culture and religion are separate things. But back to the justification in the Grand Chamber's Laozi decision here, it's a much more modest reasoning of the court, namely to say, look, we opt for pluralism in a way, the pluralist response to acknowledging neutrality and not the French militarist kind of or militantly secularism response. And we can tolerate the cross at the classroom just because the Italian school is at the same time open for minority religions. That had in fact been the line of the Italian government to defend its cross on the classroom, to say, look, we don't prohibit the burqa, we don't prohibit the foulard, we have a very pluralistic, and Silvio can probably confirm that, a very pluralistic German style, often a neutralität, a way of dealing with religion, minority and majority. Now, if that stance of the Italian state is in fact correct, which I cannot know, I cannot judge it, if this is empirically correct, that there is no particular hostility to minority religions, then it seems to me from a normative point of view a perfectly reasonable decision that the cross can keep hanging there, precisely because it's not an active indoctrination into the true religion of Christianity, but it's a passive symbol that reflects the culture and the traditions of the church.
Well, Professor Danchen, why don't you respond, but also if the other panelists would like to respond. Okay, let's continue with the questions. I apologize. She wants.
Thank you all. Thank you all for your presentations. I have two questions. One is the relationship between the crucifix and hijab as somehow occupying an equal space of symbols themselves. You know, one that has a certain kind of portability to it, hijab. So I'm wondering just conceptually if these are the same kinds of symbols that can be related in it. And the reason I ask that is precisely because the way in which one symbol, such as the crucifix, has come to be seen as just, again, either part of the furniture or symbolic, rather than the hijab, a kind of lived experience. And it leads to the very sort of ideas around, well, some of these symbols are just relics of our Christian past, which we need to reassert, and we need to reassert them not just in the absence of religion or a kind of secular public sphere in Europe, but in fact with the encroachment of Islam, because Muslims take their faith much more seriously. Right? So there's a relationship of power here as well, not just a relationship of symbols. The other is this relationship is also predicated on the fact that it's not just a relationship between minorities and majorities, but Muslim minorities in Europe are global majorities. So it's kind of drawing on Professor Roy's earlier work on how the global majorities of Muslims who become local minorities get played out in terms of not just the ethos of everyday life, but kind of legal issues. And it leads me to a more theoretical question, maybe along what Professor Danchen had also mentioned, but just the notion of Europe itself, right? Is this really about Europe reconstituting itself? Because in some ways, France and its relationship to UK or Greece or Germany, I mean, they often have relationships to their colonies much more than they have relationship to themselves as nation states. right? So is this in a way, is what we're seeing really about Europe coming to grips with itself as an idea of Europe? Because really we don't know what Europe constitutes. I mean, is it a geography, is it an idea? And in Europe really is projected as Europe only in its colonies, right? To itself, it's a kind of burgeoning idea, you know, the EU or whatever currency we might use. So is all of this, can we think of this as really about Europe reconstituting itself? Islam is incidental, or is there something else going on? And again, to reiterate the fact that Europe is really, many nation states within Europe are really tied, or the relationships are not to each other, but tied to its colonies, perhaps more so than, you know, UK might have more in relationship with you know, India or Pakistan or Caribbean or parts of Africa than it does to this idea of Europe. So those are the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you to all three speakers. My question was, I appreciated all three presentations. What I wanted to ask, what occurred to me, and to follow up on Neil's question, is that Olivia once spoke about what there's a redefinition going on, and what is driving this redefinition? And you made some suggestions of what it could be. And I was going to ask, is there a dialectic between Europe and its proxy wars in Afghanistan and Iraq via the Pax Americana? Is there something going on there? I mean, Munir talked about the ties to the colonies, but I'm asking if there's something else going on. Also, the rise of the spectre of terrorism, you know, London and Madrid and other places. And Professor Danchin, who talked very carefully about the question of rights, I was going to say, if you could say something more about how do you explain the European Court's notion of right? How does it, you said it's a large answer, but I wonder if you can zoom in there and help me out.
My question was for Professor Danchin. I thought it was very interesting how you talked about the different conceptualizations of the individual freedom of religion. And I was wondering if you could maybe address the issue of gender, just because it seems that specifically with burqa bans and the headscarf, there's some underlying concern that women are perhaps not capable of making a sort of free choice to clothe themselves in certain symbols, and would just be interested to hear your opinion about
that. So maybe I could go backwards at least through those three questions. Of course, the issue of gender has run through, particularly the Sahin case, Dogru, and the Begum case in the United Kingdom as well. You know, and it gets into this very complicated question about how we understand religion and choice or autonomy, right? And so issues of coercion obviously are real issues that have to be dealt with from a human rights perspective. But what's really troubling about the court's jurisprudence is that it doesn't engage the particular claimants that come before it. So the voices of the actual claimants are virtually absent from the decisions for anyone who's read them. So the Sahin case is perhaps the best example. I mean, here we have, I think, a third-year medical student in Istanbul seeking to wear the headscarf. The questions of coercion and freedom of choice are just not present on the facts. Right? And so instead, we see the court taking a very ideological and pejorative notion of Islam. I think at some point it says Islam is a religion that imposes, as a theological matter, these duties onto women. and makes a very broad ideological statement, which some of the dissenting judges in Sahin take up and criticize the court for. And so in other words, I don't mean to suggest that issues of coercion and choice are not real human rights problems. The difficulty, I think, comes that they aren't being dealt with as factual questions of the claimants before the court. And in fact, the English courts in Begum are much more sensitive to this question, and they seek to inquire as to the actual claims of, in that case, the schoolgirl who seeks to wear the headscarf. At a more theoretical level, of course, the work of people like Sabah Mahmood on notions of gender within Islam, I think also are helpful in seeing the normative assumptions that underlie this notion of Islam as in some sense inherently antithetical to women's rights. And I don't have time to go into that, but I think that idea is somewhat, is a fairly weak argument the more one looks at it. On Ibrahim's question on rights, on the scope, on how the court interprets Article 9, I think this is perhaps for me the most interesting and most challenging question. And what I've tried to suggest in my work is that the court's jurisprudence has what I call both rationalist and dialogic elements in it. So on the one hand, you see the court trying as a kind of matter of public reason or conceptions of rationality to articulate a theory of the scope of the right. But as soon as it tries to do it in particular cases, it has to engage with the social reality of different European nation states. And so we see this question of the scope of the right actually very dynamic and very variable in the court's jurisprudence. Right? So I mentioned this line of cases that deal with church autonomy and the line of cases that deal with injury to religious feelings. We see the court almost in dialogue with the arguments before it and expanding or contracting its notion of the right depending on that negotiated process. And I think this is a much more promising idea of thinking about the right in this kind of a horizontal or dialogic sense, rather than in some sort of French-based a priori conception of the right which we see in France. What I think these cases do show, though, is that while the court's been willing to engage in dialogue within European states, and by the way, all the cases, virtually all the cases that have come under Article 9 pre-2000 involved Christian or sort of broadly, Eastern Orthodox, broadly Christian claimants. It's only when we see the court dealing with claims of individual Muslims or Muslim communities that we see this dialogic aspect kind of shutting down and the court apologetically engaging in what I think of as hyper-rationalistic conceptions of neutrality and secularity. And so I think it's this aspect of the jurisprudence that most scholars have criticized. And lastly, on Professor Jopke's question of the symbol, of course this is a very difficult and deep discussion, but I think the arguments you made, I didn't find, I have to say, any of them persuasive. The notion of whether the symbol is passive or active, I'm not sure what those words are doing. I agree with Judge Power that the placement of the crucifix in the classroom is a statement of value. It's a symbol of a set of normative assumptions about value, and that those normative assumptions, if you start to think about them, notions of liberty itself, equality, toleration, pluralism, that the more one thinks about those values, one is forced into a kind of Christian genealogy, and then at a deeper level into questions of transcendence. I mean, I think there's something transcendent about the crucifix. It's meant to symbol transcendence. It is the quintessence of a religious symbol. And in that sense, it's doing a huge amount of work on the wall of these classrooms. And that then folds into the second question, this supposed religion-culture distinction. I just can't see it. I see religion and culture as so entangled in these cases that trying to distinguish between these normative categories or conceptual categories becomes very difficult for me. It seems almost like an intellectual way out to say that it's a cultural symbol. I don't know what that means. Just 2 points on this. Of course, if one accepts that it is a passive symbol, whatever that means, the obvious question is why the Swiss school teacher wearing a headscarf is not wearing a passive symbol. There's no suggestion that Ms. Dahlab ever spoke about her religion to her students. There's no suggestion that her religion determined her curriculum.
She's an agent of the state.
Right.
Agent of the state. Maybe even a civil servant who is actually obliged to stay neutral in way.
Right, but her headscarf could be seen purely as a passive symbol of a statement of her identity and of her commitments. It may have no impact on her teaching, on her engagement with her students. It's plausibly passive. In fact,
that's not the issue. The issue that she's an agent of the state, obliged to a certain set of rules.
Right, but there's no suggestion. There's no suggestion as an agent of the state that she, in any sense, is violating any principles of indoctrination or of teaching of religion. If a Supreme Court judge wears a yarmulke,
in the classroom, watches the teacher, doesn't watch what's in the bag.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't find that plausible.
But in Dhaka, the court does say that the scarf is a powerful external symbol that was hard to reconcile with the principle of gender equality.
Yes.
And also it says that cannot reconcile the headscarf with a message of tolerance and respect for others, equality and non-discrimination. So that's the reason.
Right, so it's this particular symbol. Whereas the crucifix is a symbol of toleration and liberty and all these things, which I'm sure would be surprising, right? But even if one doesn't accept what I'm saying,
it's a peaceful symbol.
It's a peaceful symbol, right? I mean, 2,000 years of peace. Yeah. But even if one rejects what I'm saying, when you look at the Sahin case, there you don't have an agent of the state; you have a university student. Right, simply seeking to enter the public sphere, exhibiting her religious identity. There the court says no as well, and in Dogru.
Yeah, the issue was an actual secular regime in a Muslim society. That's the separate issue.
As the time of the panel winds down, I'd love us to have Professor Ferrari and Professor Ra contribute to the conversation. So maybe we could move on to you.
Thank you. I don't think that the debate is linked with the political events. It's something which is far more in depth, and it's largely, an internal debate in Europe of what is the European identity. We have an interesting, parallel in chronology. Between the timing of immigration and the timing of European construction. Yeah. And regularly we have a crisis concerning the scarf, concerning the burqa, when we have a crisis concerning the European identity. The referendum on the Maastricht Treaty, the debate on the euro, etc. And it's very interesting to see that most of the so-called Islamophobic, so-called, I don't like the term, are also critical of the European construction. And as it has been said, the perception of Islam is a perception of a religion which is strongly embedded into a culture. While in Europe the disconnect is obvious, the secularization works, and this creates an effect of anxiety, and hence an endeavor to reconnect Christianity, culture, and identity, without putting into question the issue of faith. So it's a very fragile construction to try to reconnect religion and culture without debating on faith. We have no religion; we have only culture. And at the same time, the European public opinion doesn't understand that, in fact, the same process of relative disconnection are working in the Muslim world. That it's not just, a culture; it's far more complex. And the political events in the Muslim world are also going in the direction of recasting what religion means, which is a precondition for integration of Islam into Europe. But it's not perceived. For the more there is a change in the Muslim world, the more the Muslim world is seen from the West as unable to change. So we have a totally schizophrenic situation now. Look at most of the websites opposing Islam. There is almost not a word of what is going on now in the Arab world, because it's totally going against the paradigm of Islam they have constructed. Geert Wilders said, in January, there will be no democracy in the Arab world. Islam is incompatible with democracy. So these movements will fail. Well, and that's all, And he said that he didn't care about that. And in Italy, what is going on in the south is perceived through the lens of immigration, not through the lens of structural changes in the Arab world. And the same thing in France, by the way.
Just, I'd like to come back to the crucifix issue, because in my opinion, both the crucifix on the wall and the teacher was the scarf, and the teacher is an agent of the state. They are part of the institutional space. It is the state that speaks through them, through the crucifix on the wall, and through, to a lesser extent, also through the teacher with religious symbols. While if that religious symbol is worn by a student, we are no more in the institutional space. We are in the non-institutional public space. And so we cannot place the two things on the same level. I was against the first Laozi decision, and I am against also the second Laozi decision, basically. I find both of them very authoritarian decisions. One says the crucifix has to go by court decision, and the other says the crucifix has to stay because there is an Italian law that says so. And the students, the professors, the people who inhabit that space are completely overlooked. They have no say in this issue. And in my opinion, we should go the other way around. And the presence of religious symbols should be eventually the outcome of an internal debate of the people who inhabit that space. A completely different approach, in my opinion. Maybe not. How? That is, I don't know. But for example, in Bavaria, they have a procedure to deal with these cases. I mean, the crucifix is there, but it should go away if there is not a consensus. That is a way. Not the only one, but I like it because it makes students and professors responsible for their habitat and for their choices. And this is part of the education also. And so it's particularly appropriate in school, in my opinion.
Let me, on behalf of the group, thank our presenters for beginning our deliberations so effectively with such substantial and stimulating papers. We will, although there have been various adjustments to the schedule, The break is a universal sacred space, and we won't violate human rights by canceling any breaks. So there's time to caffeinate, and we'll resume after a 15-minute break. But please join me in thanking our three speakers.